The most dangerous moment of this war may come after the guns fall silent. Because for the first time since Russia invaded Ukraine, two European powers, Britain and France, are preparing to send troops not to fight a war, but to lock in its ending. Only after a peace deal. Only after the shooting stops. That paradox should make you pause. This is not escalation in the traditional sense. It is Europe admitting something it avoided for 3 years. That weapons alone cannot end this conflict. Deterrence must come after diplomacy. And someone must physically stand between a fragile ceasefire and the next invasion. Russia has already warned those troops would be legitimate targets. The United States is stepping forward as a monitor, not a shield. And Ukraine is being asked to trust that guarantees on paper will hold in the real world. If you want to understand where this war is truly heading, stay with me. Because before we can judge this decision, we must understand the problem it is trying and risking to solve. What is being negotiated in Paris is not simply a ceasefire. It is an attempt to redefine responsibility for Ukraine's survival after the war pauses. And that distinction matters. For 3 years, support for Ukraine has followed a familiar pattern. Weapons flow in, red lines are declared, and escalation is carefully avoided. What Britain and France are now discussing breaks that pattern. Troops would not arrive to defeat Russia. They would arrive to prevent its return. Military hubs, secured skies and seas, a multinational presence designed less for combat than for deterrence. At the same time, the United States is repositioning itself, not as a permanent guarantor, but as a verifier, monitoring a truce, backstopping protocols, leaving Europe to carry more of the physical risk. Hovering over all of this is the unresolved core of the war: territory. Where the line is drawn, what Ukraine is asked to accept, and what Russia is willing to tolerate. To understand why this moment feels both urgent and fragile, we need to step back into how this war reached a point where peace now requires soldiers. To understand this shift, we have to return to how this war settled into its current rhythm. After Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, the conflict did not end in breakthrough or collapse. It hardened, lines froze, territory changed hands slowly. Moscow entrenched itself across roughly a fifth of Ukraine. Kyiv fought to hold, reclaim, and survive. Over time, the war became attritional. Each winter carried higher costs, infrastructure was struck, cities absorbed daily pressure, and with every passing season, the strategic question quietly changed from how to win to how long this could be sustained. Diplomacy followed the same cycle. Early peace frameworks appeared, leaked, and collapsed. One US-led plan was seen by Kiev and its European allies as tilted toward Russia, triggering months of renegotiation. Ukraine responded with revised proposals, security guarantees, reconstruction provisions, adjusted points, progress, but never closure. What emerged was a stalemate not just on the battlefield, but in expectations. Ukraine could not easily concede territory. Russia would not easily stop advancing. And yet, the costs of continuing were rising faster than the gains. This is how wars move toward uneasy endings, not through victory, but through exhaustion. And that exhaustion sets the stage for the first real crisis of peace. The first crisis is not on the battlefield, it is in the silence from Moscow. While European leaders speak of guarantees and deployment frameworks, Russia has said almost nothing, except one thing. Any foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, Moscow warns, would be legitimate targets. That single sentence exposes the fragility of the entire plan, because deterrence only works if it is believed. And belief depends on restraint from the very actor being deterred. At the same time, fighting has not paused. Russian forces continue slow advances. Strikes against cities and critical infrastructure continue daily. For Ukrainians, the idea of negotiating peace while missiles still fall feels abstract, even dangerous. For leaders, it feels unavoidable. This is where pressure intensifies. Another winter of war means more attrition, more lives lost, more strain on a population already exhausted. Zelensky knows this. He has called the recent talks a milestone, but not a guarantee. A peace deal may be close. He has said 90%, yet the remaining 10% holds everything that matters. If this analysis helps you see beyond official statements, take a moment to engage with it. These moments shape what comes next. Because the real crisis is not whether troops arrive, it is whether the system behind them can hold. What makes this moment so complex is what lies beneath the headlines. The hidden mechanism is not military. It is legal, political, and psychological. Britain and France are not offering Ukraine a NATO-style guarantee. There is no Article 5, no automatic response. Instead, they are proposing something more ambiguous and more fragile, a framework, a declaration of intent, a legal pathway that allows foreign forces to operate on Ukrainian soil without formally expanding the war. This ambiguity is deliberate. It gives Europe flexibility, it gives Washington room to maneuver, and it gives Moscow uncertainty. But it also creates risk, because deterrence built on interpretation rather than obligation depends on constant credibility. Notice the language being used. Ukraine speaks of security guarantees. American officials speak of security protocols. That difference matters. Guarantees imply commitment. Protocols imply procedure. In between those two words sits the future of peace. For Ukraine, this mechanism must reassure a skeptical public that the war will not simply restart. For Europe, it must deter without provoking. For the United States, it must support without owning. This is not a clean system. It is a compromise machine, and such machines are tested not when things go right, but when they go wrong, which brings us to the second, more dangerous crisis. The second crisis is sharper, and it cuts through territory. Behind closed doors, negotiators are circling the most explosive question of the war, where the ceasefire line would actually run. And here, progress slows to a crawl, because maps do not just mark land. They mark legitimacy, sacrifice, and loss. Russia currently controls large portions of eastern Ukraine, much of Donetsk, nearly all of Luhansk. Moscow has been clear. It wants Ukrainian forces out of the Donbass, or it will take it by force. Ukraine has been equally clear in public, no territory will be ceded. Yet in practice, even Kyiv has hinted at withdrawals to agreed points, but only if Russia does the same. This is the pressure point. A peace that freezes the front line risks looking like surrender. A peace that redraws it risks collapse. And a peace without clarity risks immediate violation. For Ukrainians watching cities struck daily, any deal that leaves occupied land behind is hard to accept. For leaders facing another winter of war, refusing all compromise may be even harder. This is where peace deals fail, not in principle, but in geography. And when geography fails, the burden shifts to people. For the people of Ukraine, the stakes of these negotiations are deeply personal. This is no longer abstract diplomacy, it is about survival, trust, and hope. Every discussion in Paris, every declaration of intent, every security protocol carries real consequences for those waking up to sirens and snow-covered streets. You, the viewer, must understand what it feels like. Citizens wondering if their homes, schools, and hospitals will endure the next strike, families calculating whether to stay or flee, and leaders like Zelensky trying to convince a war-weary population that pursuing peace now, even if imperfect, is the better path than enduring another brutal winter. This is where emotion intersects with policy. The announcement of multinational forces is not just a legal maneuver, it is a promise to the people that the war might truly end. And in that promise lies a delicate hope, a hope that, if reinforced by action, could save lives and restore faith in governance. If you feel the weight of these choices, consider the courage it takes to negotiate while missiles fall. Because the decisions made today ripple far beyond Ukraine's borders. The consequences of these decisions are already spilling beyond Ukraine's borders. Europe watches, uneasy but attentive, aware that the outcome will redefine security on the continent. The United States monitors not as a guarantor, but as a referee, aware that any misstep could draw it deeper into the conflict. Neighboring countries calculate their own vulnerabilities. Economies brace for disruption. Alliances are tested, and credibility is measured not by words, but by whether commitments are upheld. A misjudged move could trigger a domino effect, fuel shortages, refugee waves, and geopolitical tension that extend far beyond Kiev or Moscow. Even distant powers track the conflict, understanding that the model being tested here, a multinational force stabilizing a post-conflict zone, could set a precedent for future crises. This is not just a European war. It is a test of global order, of how nations intervene, and how wars are contained once the fighting slows. And yet, all of this depends on a delicate chain of trust and restraint, stretching from diplomats' tables to the front lines in Ukraine. Now we reach the future three possible paths that Ukraine, Europe, and the world might follow. The first path is hopeful, a durable peace. Security guarantees hold. Multinational forces stabilize the front lines. Ukraine rebuilds sovereignty intact, and Europe demonstrates it can act decisively to deter aggression. The war becomes a closed chapter, lessons learned, alliances strengthened. The second path is mixed, an uneasy compromise. Ceasefire lines leave some territory contested. Troops stabilize parts of the country, but ambiguities linger. Kiev survives, but citizens remain wary. Russia holds leverage, testing international resolve. Peace exists, but as a fragile equilibrium, always one misstep from escalation. The third path is grim, a frozen war. Negotiations fail, troops face constant threats, and Moscow continues slow advances. Europe's promise falters. Ceasefires are temporary. Ukraine endures another brutal winter, and the human toll rises. The conflict becomes a protracted struggle, with uncertainty as the only constant. Each path reflects more than tactics. It reflects how nations navigate compromise, trust, and risk in a world where peace is never guaranteed. And that, above all, defines the stakes of this moment. As we reach the conclusion, one insight becomes clear. Peace is not simply the absence of war. It is the presence of guarantees, credibility, and action. The declarations from Britain and France, the security protocols shaped in Paris, and the delicate balance of trust between Kiev, Moscow, and Washington. These are not abstract gestures. They are the scaffolding upon which the next chapter of Europe's security will be built. And you, watching this unfold, must understand the stakes. This is a war that tests not just armies, but the very systems that hold nations accountable. Will promises on paper translate into protection on the ground? Will multinational forces deter aggression or merely freeze a conflict that flares again at the first opportunity? The moment to reflect and act is now. Watch closely, share widely, and engage thoughtfully, because the decisions made today will echo far beyond Ukraine, shaping the fate of Europe and the world. This is not just news. It is history in motion.